So hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Bridging Distance webinar on hybrid work strategy and what we're calling navigating the messy middle. My name is Stefanie Heiter. I am the founder and CEO of Bridging Distance and have been doing research and consulting and training in the world of virtual work for 25 years now, and so have lots of expertise and stories and all kinds of things. We could spend the whole day together and we could share stories. So, and I wanted to welcome Janet Swaysland. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, Stephanie and I go a ways back now. I work in an adjacent area to Stephanie and as part of her team, focusing on culture and engagement, which has had some challenges in the last a year and several months, and so it's that's my focus, and you'll see some of that coming through today.
Great, thanks. I'm happy to have you joining us. Just a little bit, this is a kind of a sense of how long we've been playing in this space. Started in 1996 when I did my master's thesis on trust and global teams, and have continued. So you can see a little bit around the evolution, and our work is really based on research. Some of actually my research team is on this call, and so really happy to be able to offer some of those solutions in a time where it really, really matters. So just a little bit, won't go through this, but it's kind of interesting to see what was happening in the world relative to each of these. So for our time today, we're going to start with kind of defining what hybrid is, and then move into looking at some challenges and some factors that are impacted by that, and then go through and look at a foundation for the strategy. And then in terms of the shift that we're talking about, what's the payoff? So what do you get from it by doing this? And then hopefully we'll have some time for question and answers, but we will try to monitor through the chat and take care of that. So, and again, at the end, happy to stay on past a little bit of the time and answer questions or take you off mute and we can chat. So that's what we're going to do. So again, thinking about where we are now, looking to navigate through this, what we're calling this messy middle. And it means really drawing on the best of both worlds, so best of the in-person and the remote world. So in order to do that, to get a little bit of a sense of that, I'd like to launch a poll and ask you each to think about, what is your plan? Are you going to remain fully remote? Is your company considering going hybrid? Are you committed to going hybrid? Are you going to return fully to office, or are you unsure and have no idea? So let me launch the poll, and just answer the first one for now. Again, what is your plan? Okay. Give it about 10 more seconds. Again.
It sounds like everybody has to answer both in order to submit.
Yeah, okay. I have to set that up differently. Lesson for me, note to self.
Hey, we'll just be super efficient here, Steph.
That's it. We'll save us some time. So, okay, let's take another 5 seconds to respond to these. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, last chance to enter. Getting a few more, so.
Yeah, do answer both, everybody.
Okay, so I'm going to end polling and then we'll share the results. So looking at this, interesting, and this is actually committed to going hybrid. Very interesting. That's close to 50%. That's amazing. And what's interesting too is this is actually a little bit different, because what we're seeing in a poll we did on LinkedIn and some other places is that there's a lot more people who are unsure or have no idea. So this is exciting. Maybe things have changed and people are getting more structured. And then the sense in terms of where do you think things are going to be? Oh yeah, again, big difference. 44% think it's going to be somewhat harder. So yeah, that sort of falls in line with what we're seeing. And if you have any comments about that, feel free to put them into the chat. So,
and guys, when you do use the chat, be sure to choose panelists and everyone, unless you really just want to talk to Stefanie and me.
We'll get back to you later. Okay. Defining hybrid. What are we talking about when we say hybrid? So it's various combinations of in-person and virtual, remote teams and work environments. Some people working a few days in person, a few days remote. Some people working fully in person or fully remote. Not all interactions are digital, and there's very reliance on technology to be productive. So for that, we have looked at what are some of the concerns that are happening in terms of what are the leaders' top priorities in hybrid work. So this is kind of a combination of lots of stuff that we've read, research that we've done, and our own experiences in having multiple conversations over these last 6, 9, 12 months and before that. One is maintaining company culture. The second is maintaining team cohesion. And part of that is a lot of the responses that you gave us. Part of this in terms of the concerns was around communication, around team building, breaking down COVID increased silos. So what that means is that what we're seeing is a big jump in silos within companies because people don't have those informal interactions and are able to kind of talk to each other in, these kind of, collisions or community collisions that they talk about, in real places. So they're really just talking with people who are inside your own work teams, and you have to be intentional. Balancing employee input with top-down decisions. So again, it's that above and below, and how do we figure out how people are doing and what do they need? And then, as always, it's recruiting and retaining top talent. And how do you do that in COVID? And what are the aspects to that happen? And then
what's interesting, Stefanie, and the flip side of the priorities are the challenges. The concerns. It's like, these are not all easy. So what are the kind of the concerns, the hurdles for realizing success in these priorities? One is the obvious of space, and how do you do it so that it's not just sanitary? How do you create your space to enable all these priorities that you have, as well as balancing those who are there and those who are not? There's hybrid certainly introduces a level of complexity. People did a really good job in most cases pivoting to pure remote, but that was one thing, except for the frontline people who still had to be in. But now with more widespread hybrid, that's going to get a little trickier. So how do we kind of overcome some of that, and acknowledging the differences without letting them get in the way? And then as you start making decisions about your policies, keeping people on the bus. They may not like all those policies if they don't have enough freedom, or if it just again, the flip side of the recruitment and retention, getting comfortable with imperfect data. I mean, the CDC and the government is not going to tell you how to structure your hybrid strategy. They were pretty clear about the early days of the pandemic, but now there's a lot more latitude, and that means it's harder. And guess what? There's change fatigue, which has become we already had change fatigue before the pandemic. Now we have it in spades. So these are all things that are kind of challenges to those priorities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. And again, feel free to put into the chat, and we'll save that as something to share. But any concerns or challenges that you have, and thanks for those who shared some ahead of time. That was really helpful in terms of structuring up our presentation to make sure we're meeting everybody's needs. So again, let's look at two critical factors in your return to office planning. The first is location type complexity, and the second is team-based or interdependency, so the need for team-based work. Let's start with the first. When you look at the workplace location complexity, many years ago, some people probably don't even remember this, but all employees would commute to a shared office building, and there was lots of space, and maybe there was a ball field in the back and all kinds of things there. And then things started to get global, and then we had multiple buildings. Either it was a campus, or you were, different parts of the country, different parts of the world. But employees generally commuted to a company building. And so, they wasn't kind of a worker from home. Then we moved into this kind of some building and some home space, where some employees commute to a company building while some employees work all or part-time from a home office. Might have started with waiting for the cable guy to come, or doing something at home. The washing machine needed to be fixed. And then it moved to some people working at home on Fridays. And then some of it was people would be fully remote, and then others would just have them a couple days. So some combinations of that. And then, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, we moved into this concept of other co-working spaces. Third place, a newer concept that's come back again is called the pop-up office. So any of those co-working spaces also became part of the location complexity. And then in March of 2020, we have this all home offices, or majority home offices, where people were working full-time or all of their hours. And we put that in as a distinction because sometimes it was different people in terms of different hours, but they were working from a home office. So that's the workplace location complexity. I have to change words to make it easier to say. The second is the degree of team-based work needed. So how interdependent is your team, right? How much coordination do you have? So we go from this idea of cooperation, where independent people or groups share information to support each other's goals, right? So that's number one. We just have to cooperate with each other. So examples of that might be some of the initiatives that take place, and we just have to get this goal around hiring or some other things. Then we move towards coordination, which is these independent people actually have to align activities to support each other's goals, all the way up to collaboration, where independent people or groups have to actively work together to realize a shared goal or shared goals. So that continuum becomes really important in terms of level of interdependency. So what I'd ask you to do is to look at this in terms of the chart. So on the horizontal was the location complexity, and on the vertical, we have going up from 1 to a 5, the degree of team-based work. So how much overlap, how much interdependency, how much collaboration do you need? And I'm going to ask you each to put these into the chat, and we'll, and Janet and then potentially Matthew will read some of those out. So let me just say here in the chat, what is your number for location complexity, 1 to 5? And what is the number for degree of team-based work needed? Again, 1 to 5. So again, putting into the chat, just 2 numbers. The first is your location along the horizontal, and the second is your degree of team-based work needed along the vertical. And let me put the chart back up so you can see it, and we'll take a minute. Can we read some of those out?
Yeah, we've got a 4-4 and a 5-5. Yep, there's some complexity right there. 4 by 5, 5-4, 3-5. Varies. I can see why this particular group has joined this webinar, Stephanie. 1-5, that's interesting.
1-5, okay.
That's interesting.
Wow.
4-2. Okay. So yeah, so it's not a monolith, is it? It's not, so there's not one solution.
So hold on to looking at this, hold on to this as we go through. And we did this poll question. Again, the majority of folks felt like it was going to be somewhat harder compared to the last 12 months as we move into what we're calling this messy middle.
And why would that be, Stephanie? Why would that be? Why is hybrid the most complex? Well, that's because,
there you go.
Yeah, that's because, there's this bias is something we talk about so much more now, as we should. And there's another one for the list, which is proximity or location bias. Are there advantages? Are people treated differently based on where they sit or where they sit today or yesterday? So that is something to really work into your planning. The formal agreements and plans, the degree of formality that's needed in different settings, visibility and access are different, partly because senior leaders who are in locations where some team members or employees might have a bit of an advantage informally, generally. It's easier to find people or connect, or maybe not anymore. If you have done a great job with remote and you have good technology, you may be able to find people, but you're not going to find them walking the halls on remote. And so, and just recognizing that, bringing some empathy to the situation, because it is different for people, and the degrees of what are the rules, anyway. So these are some of the things that make hybrid a bit more complex.
I'd be curious, and maybe people in the chat can add their own 2 cents. Have you experienced some of these things in your current situation? Many of you have said you're already hybrid.
I'd love to hear also if there's things that you're finding that aren't necessarily here in terms of the complexity of it. So yeah, thanks, Matthew. Okay, so here's again going back to our location on the horizontal and the degree of team-based work on the vertical. What we have is hybrid. So as Janet was just talking about why it's so complex, here we have a visual for that, in that there are some people who are in, maybe they're on a 1 or a 2, and then some people are on a 5 or a 5 or a 4 and 5, whatever it happens to be. The hybrids now, you're going to have in-person and remote. They're in the middle here, and so they have varied needs for this. So down on the bottom, when you're in person all together and you have low need for interdependency, having agreements and processes, reliable technologies, tools, systems, all those aspects is a nice to have. And that's particularly critical when the leader is also located in that location, which is something to consider when you're looking at hybrid around where your leadership sits. All the way up to the top, where you have to have formal agreements and processes and reliable technologies. This is critical for people who are working remotely and sort of disengaged or physically located in different places. And so what we talk about here is formalizing the informal, or making the implicit explicit, so that everybody can be successful. So we hear a lot about people's concerns moving forward on things being fair and equitable. And part of that comes here in terms of allowing remote workers to be as successful as those in person, regardless of how often they work from home, is kind of that fairness that comes in. And we'll talk more about some of the strategies about how to do this. So coming up. Janet, anything to add?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. All right. So, it's trigger happy. So we have a model that we've been using for a long time, and it's a model that we're looking at about thinking through what hybrid is. And we'll take you through it overview, and then we'll go back and give you some suggestions in terms of what those might look like. But again, feel free to add your own concerns, your own ideas, your own suggestions, and of course, we'll have questions at the end. So, but feel free to do this as we take you through this. The first of the ideas is mindsets. And by mindsets, I'm sorry, my computer's being slow. By mindsets, what we look at here are an established set of attitudes and resulting behaviors that reflect beliefs about virtual work. So again, we can say here we are looking at the awareness of these attitudes and resulting behaviors, and then the habits, right? So I can know what the right thing to do is, and I talk about this all the time, right? So especially post-COVID, maybe someday I'll go into a restaurant again, and I've been like, oh, I haven't eaten that well, so I'm gonna go in, and the right thing to do is for me to have a salad and a seltzer. But I get there, and I'm waiting for Janet to join me, and don't they have my favorite red wine? So I get a glass of red wine, and then, oh, on the menu is, lobster mac and cheese. So I got to get that, right? But I'll only eat half of it, so I'll get some in the to-go box, right? So I know what the right thing is, but does that actually translate into my behaviors? And so that's what we want to look at in terms of mindsets and the way in which culture drives that. And Janet will share some tips about that in a minute.
And we know that you don't actually bring that half home. You eat it on
I know, of course not. Of course not. Yeah. I'll give it to you, Matthew. There you go. Structures. So the idea here is policies, processes, and procedures that are both formal and informal. And what is interesting about this dimension is that we can have lots of formal processes and we can assess those and do all that. It's the informal pockets that are a little bit harder to challenge and replicate. And therefore, this is where surveying and polling comes in and really important to understand. So when Janet talked about, when we talked about that top down and bottom up kind of conversations, to see what's happening and what's working and the informal. So that's what we want to do in terms of structures, to try to formalize that and make the informal really as easy as possible for people to replicate. The third is competencies. So do you have the necessary capabilities, both with skills and then innate abilities? And we make the distinction in terms of what you can learn and then what is innate that you want to build up on. And then the last aspect, not to be forgotten in any kind of virtual hybrid situation, is technology, both equipment and then the support structure. I remember many, many years ago, working with virtual teams. This is probably 20 years ago, and I think some of you who were on the call actually knew me then, that people would be traveling to other parts of the world, and the help desk was only available maybe 8 to 6 in the time zone of the headquarters. And so you'd arrive in Europe or Singapore or wherever and couldn't log on and had no support. So again, thinking about the ways in which those happen. So let's dive in a little bit and start with mindsets.
Okay. Yeah, so think of mindsets as culture. And I know a lot of you have this on your minds: culture, engagement. Actually, all of these pieces of the model intersect, of course. They all support each other. You can't just have one. But this model will help you kind of challenge your plan or get ideas for your plan to make sure that you've covered all the critical bases. But some examples of how to apply mindset solutions to your plan are really looking at the consistency of your habits and rituals, whether you're remote or in the office. What can you make sure you're carrying through? For example, one easy one is how you start and end meetings. If you're in a conference room in the office, have the same habits, the same kinds of routines that you would do in a Zoom meeting, so that you're carrying forward, you're leveling that playing field. There will be differences, of course, but try to maintain some sameness there. In a similar way, maintain some equity in what employees get, whether in the office. What we're going to start to see as people go back to the office a little bit is people in the office are getting all kinds of food. They're going to get some freebies. They're going to have speakers come in. There's going to be some conveniences. Maybe your dry cleaning gets picked up again. Maybe you get free parking. I don't know. So think about the people who are not in the office and how to, it's not everybody gets the same exact things, but ask yourself, does it feel equal? And then leaders need to model those values as always. But where this is a little more challenging, very intentional. Be very intentionally visible and demonstrating values in all these contexts, and ensure those values are portable, consistent, and showing up, and engage people in talking about how our values can help us navigate all of this. That's engagement right there.
Yeah. And a quick point around the portable, Janet, is that when we consult or counsel teams internally on this subject of the hybrid strategy, this idea of portable is really often a surprise to people. And so I just want to reemphasize what Janet is saying, in that because your values, your company values, are the foundation for decisions and so many other things that become important.
Right.
So I just really want to stress that
Yep.
again in terms of being able to look at that. And if people have examples of that, put them in the chat or feel free to ask questions when we're done. Okay, so the second aspect, the second dimension of this is structures. And those are the policies, procedures, both formal and informal here. Excuse me. And what we mean here are a couple of things to consider. First of all, designing flexible processes to ensure fair and equitable application. So this has to do with working hours, compensation, and we have somebody in our team who's has expertise in benefits, but in terms of compensation, big questions about, do you compensate people differently based on where they're located because the cost of living goes down? We know that lots of people have actually physically moved their location in COVID to feel like they can work remotely. Thinking about onboarding new talent, so making sure that those processes are fair, assigning a buddy, all the other aspects to onboarding somebody in these situations. Some criteria for who can work where. That becomes really important as well around that. Explicit and actively communicated return to office plan, criteria, expectations, and how-tos. There was a recent article in Boston.com that surveyed, and it was a voluntary survey, so they had up to close to 2,000 people respond to it. And what they were saying is 60% of the people who responded to that survey do not yet know what their return to office plan will be. They haven't heard anything from their leadership. So sometimes at least communicating the fact that your criteria for that return plan. So is our criteria going to be our location, job type, seniority, whatever other aspects to it that makes sense. And then being able to make sure you communicate at least that, because what we're seeing is an unnecessary level of stress and that fatigue that Janet talked about earlier that's due to the fact of the unknown. And, if you've been in corporations even for 6 months, that people will read into silence. They will read all kinds of things into silence.
Well, and the other thing in the company that I work for, the reality is it's not on the list, right? I mean, our priority is safety, health, and wellness. And so even communicating that it's not yet part of that, forefront of that conversation is important.
Mm-hmm. Wellness is a great point, Matt, because wellness is a big word that we're hearing as well, employee wellness. We were consulting with a head of operations of a global company, SVP, and he started the conversation by saying, I'm worried about the emotional health and wellness of my employees. And
Absolutely.
I said, okay, you have me there. I might even do this for free. So I was just really refreshed by that. Maintain a regular communications cadence. So pick a time. Can you manage, weekly messages from leadership, whether it's written, video, and then having a feedback loop to hear, okay, so maybe we can have those weekly messages where we're recording a quick video, taking turns, sending them out. Maybe it's twice a month, but keeping that regular cadence really helps because it adds predictability in a messy middle that is really unpredictable and for so many of us unknown. And then lastly, monitor performance feedback processes for potential imbalances between in-person and remote. And again, thinking about one of the differentials between in-person and remote is that power differential. So levels of visibility differ and access to resource can really hinder somebody's success and unduly. So you want to think about in-performance feedback and making them shorter, more frequent check-ins. So from a broad HR perspective, as well as each of the leaders, making sure you're monitoring that and making sure that unknowingly those in person have a higher level of power and access and visibility to what they need. Okay.
And then the next piece is competencies. These are the skills. How can we equip people and support them to do a great job for themselves and for their people in this environment? So some solutions here are really segmenting your training, your toolkits, your support for leaders so they can lead from everywhere, which is not a natural gift. They need help. They need help. And managers as well. And then include all employees on kind of what good looks like now, what things might surprise you, would be in the way or helpful for collaborating, for coaching your people, how you build trust, tips and tricks on running meetings, kind of watch outs, blind spots on unconscious bias, for example. This is where the learning and development teams need to really have a strong pivot and bring hybrid into many of their programs, not just kind of a hybrid track, and really focus on formal and informal team building too, how to do that. Because this part is a little trickier. Again, we've done a great job adapting to a kind of a pure hybrid, pure remote in a lot of cases. Now we have to learn how to have one foot in each world. And so how do we support people doing that, helping them see what works, why some things are difficult, and practical tips for doing that, where to get help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have a ton of resources on our website and blogs and all kinds of stuff for people. If you're
You really should
stuck,
just
feel
call
free to reach out
Stefanie
to us.
is the answer here, but
That's right. I could talk about this till the cows come home. So, all right. And the last piece of it is technology. And again, it's both the tools as well as the support around that. So supports as a help desk, but also how are people trained and utilizing it, and does it vary? And it's particularly important. What we used to see a lot is that the in-person people would get really robust training, but the remote ones who need it the most got the training that was really not effective and a little bit more challenging, and they're the ones who really needed those tutorials. So again, some solutions here around technologies: commit resource to the tools that promote engagement. So, lots of apps. There's so many things that have popped up, some cool stuff that's popped up, mind mapping, brainstorming, innovation, all of those. So using those tools, and also using asynchronous modalities, so non-real-time technologies, because there's this sense of change fatigue, but also digital fatigue, where you don't always have to be on in real time. And again, if you want to have a fair and equitable team, and you have 9 time zones that you're spanning, or 12 time zones, then it's impossible for you, and especially depending if there's a core group or headquarters that are further from you. You just want to make sure that you're using asynchronous. Sometimes that also leads to better decision making, because you can say, listen, I want input for everybody because I'm going to make this decision in 48 hours. I posted something and I just want to hear from everybody, so please weigh in and I'll make the decision at da-da-da-da. And then again, being able to have tools for informal interactions. There's lots of really cool stuff around that. Games you can play, quizzes. You can also just, text with each other, all different kinds of things in terms of promoting. Again, remember, back on our hybrid model or the other one is making sure you're formalizing the informal. And therefore, if you don't formalize the informal, the in-person people will have an advantage in terms of the power.
Stefanie, I think we're going to get into this, but I don't remember explicitly. Not everything has to be live, right? It's important to be present and be visible, but I think that we're going to get into at some point in a little bit what things make sense to do in which ways. Is that still something we're going to go over? No,
but actually that's a really good point, Matt, because it's actually on our website. So we can dig it up and put it into the chat, or you can reach out to us. But there's a visual in terms of that we put on the website, or it's on LinkedIn. I don't remember where. Sam, if you're on, if you could find that too. But it really looks at this idea of social presence versus technology versus data richness. And that's where understanding the degree of interdependency and how much team-based work you need also then drives how much asynchronous stuff you can do. And how do you balance those pieces? So if we find that on the site, just put it on the chat, or we will include it when we send it out. When we send out the link to the recording. So great, thanks. Yeah, good points, Matt. Thanks. Ensure that technology support is available equally to all. Again, varied help desk and resources creates an unequal power distribution and puts those who are further from the main locations at a disadvantage. And then, this is actually my favorite part, this idea of reimagining workspaces to maximize collaboration. That has been great fun for my team to work with companies around thinking about the workspaces. So how do we, so again, as an example here, if you know how much interdependency you need, you will also know how much in-person or real-time interaction you want. So you can then engage better when you pull people in, how often you pull them in, and what that looks like. And then, as so many companies are downsizing their physical footprint, you have an opportunity to redesign those spaces in ways that technologies can, I put level the playing field here, but one of our clients who that they're from the UK, they talked about it as leveling the pitch. So so again, making sure that you have those structures and the aspects in place to make sure people have that sense of fairness. And again, questions or comments, please put them into the chat so we can do that. And again, here, applying this model, right? So here's a couple of things that we've been doing that may be helpful for you to consider, right? So applying this collaborative approach. One is to co-create the new strategy. So with HR and other teams, we see that if HR is the only one in the conversation around design, sometimes it's a little bit limiting. So you want to, in very least, make sure you're surveying as you co-create that new strategy. Looking at online training options. So we have virtual leader, influencing digitally, remote worker boot camps, and we just revamped these because some of my research team is on this meeting. But we just finished research on looking at the impact of culture, national culture and corporate culture on technology, collaboration, technology use and adoption. And we redid our research that we did pre-COVID. So we finished it up in February 2020 on the impact of digital isolation and loneliness on workplace productivity. And we just replicated that to see what's changed. And so my team actually, we're getting together later today and over the next few weeks to look for webinars as we share some of the results and findings we had from that. But again, we'll impact our trainings, our remote worker toolkits, being able to design and facilitate team building workshops, also attending some of the virtual team and coaching, so offering those. We have virtual team informal water cooler sessions where you can get real-time challenges from people in different companies, and we do those once a month. You can attend, team building and give positive feedback and suggestions. So those are just some things that we put together that we've been doing over the last year, but also in a lot of ways the last 25 years. So, and then
so
Janet?
So true, yeah. So I think if you just kind of catch your breath and think about some of the research behind why things are tricky and difficult and what eases the path to a good hybrid strategy using the model, that four-part model will really help you get through your planning process in a way that accomplishes these kinds of benefits. You'll increase competency because you'll know what you're trying to develop. You'll keep people on board and without too much change friction, maintaining these productive, high-performing teams that you've been developing until now. Let's not have a hiccup during this transition. And smoothing the change, anticipating what's going to be tricky, and getting there first. Reducing the biases that I think we're only now starting to really learn about when it comes to, proximity and remote. And then, lean on what we know already works. The model that Bridging Distance has put together will really support you and help you bring others to your planning process. It will be something that you can use to co-create your plan. So those are some of the things that hopefully help you relax a little bit during this time, this messy middle. And hopefully today you got some tips and some encouragement.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and a couple of things. We have our tips and blogs. We have lots of webinars, checklists, and different kinds of coffee talks and water coolers. So really informal opportunities to get on a smaller group, intimate group, and share ideas in a confidential and supported way, so we can move forward on those. So let me stop, and we're going to stop for a minute and just say, what questions do you have? What random thoughts do you have? Put those into either the chat, or you can also ask to unmute, and we can go from there.
Well, Stefanie, as I'm looking for this link that I can't find yet, what I realize is that we've now been able to add a bunch of the snack size bites in video content for people, and that's pretty awesome. I hadn't seen that on the site yet.
Yep. As will this, and then we'll take some of these smaller pieces, talk about all of the aspects of the model, and put those out there as well. Feel free to follow us on our LinkedIn page as well. We do a really great job of posting small things that we're learning ourselves and also find. So
it's a good place, and there's good conversation there too. You'll find a tribe of people who are grappling with similar things and sharing their solutions too. And yes, you all will get a recording of the session, and in the recording, of course, you'll see all of the content. Let's see.
Questions, comments, things you want to share? Go ahead.
I worry about in-person gatherings unintentionally excluding remote workers, such as forgetting to connect online. Thoughts on ways for remote workers to pop in virtually to physical spaces?
It's a little harder for the remote folks to initiate that because they don't have access to not necessarily. But what you can do is, so we use, in our team, we use Microsoft Teams. So if you have the chat, that text, so if you have Teams on your smartphone, you can text people, you can find each other. So some of that it's a great team building activity. I mean, team building doesn't have to be 2.5 days anymore, and it doesn't even involve jumping out of trees and shooting paintball at each other. Team building can be as simple as, let's talk about how we find each other. Let's talk about what we can do as a team to make sure that we're not forgetting to bring in the remote people, because there's nothing more disengaging than to say they forgot about me. It used to happen all the time. So again, if you can come up with ways in terms of using chat, if you have a standard meeting, ways in which you're starting a meeting, making sure that, okay, let's make sure all the remote people are here and that nobody's having technical difficulties, and can we do a sound check? Something like that. And if you make that as standard as part of your meeting, and I think Janet addressed that in the structures, was to say maybe the first item is, okay, is everybody here? Well, Matt's not here because he's on vacation,
Yeah, there you can try to just create some habits, even some language, so that when you're using that Teams chat, for example, there's a signal, which is, hey, I'm here. Or if you use, it's kind of like a subject line that everybody agrees is for a certain purpose. It's a quick way to go, oh, right. It's not just that you have a question about something. So if you create some signals, kind of your safe word, the equivalent of a safe word to pop up when you want to be included.
Yep. There's a question here also in the Q&A from Ken. Are we seeing generational differences in the ease of shifting to hybrid between Gen Z, millennial versus boomers and Xers? I mean, this is a more complicated conversation, but two things are there. One is that Gen Z and millennials are just expecting to be able to be remote. And so, for them, it's not whether, it's how and how often and what supports will I have. That's what we're seeing. Love to hear other thoughts. And then the other aspect of it is their comfort with technology and the fact that, I have a Gen Z and I have millennials as children. And especially for my Gen Z, there's no difference for him in terms of relationships that happen digitally versus in person, because that's how he's always worked. And so I think that we want to make sure we take that into account. Ken, hopefully that answers your question, but feel free to stay on after or put into the chat. And other people who have this experience would love to hear other people's input, and even from Jana and Matt.
Yeah, and here's another interesting one, Stephanie. Any advice on how to handle people who are not happy to be back in the office, or those who are nervous about being around people they haven't been around in so long? Some extroverts may have become introverts over this time. Who knows?
Well,
yeah, our social skills.
think,
You're seeing a lot of articles now too about reclaiming your social skills. You're like in-person social skills.
Yep.
And
yep. It's the same as putting on socks for the first time, right? So, so I think some of what we're seeing is the big question that begs is, are you mandating that people come in? And that the conversation about mandating people to return to a physical office space is a really loaded one, because there's a gazillion reasons why they can say, for medical reasons I can't, or all of that. But the big part of that is it undoes morale, and then it keeps that sort of sense of stress. Yeah, and trust, right? So if possible, it's great to have it be optional. If it has to be mandated, then I think you have to do your best to reassure those people that, you know, we put in new filters and we're doing social distance, and just reiterate again and again the factors that are going into place to help that happen. I'd love to hear thoughts again from each of you, or from Jana and Matt, in terms of what you're seeing or hearing around this. But I think the biggest loaded question is, when you mandate people come back, it feels like you're automatically coming from a place of one down.
Right, and you know, if you're going to do that, I think your first step is going to be explaining the why. What is the rationale? There may be something people don't realize is important, but for them to come around and be more comfortable, you're gonna have to do those two things. What is the why? Why are we doing this? Otherwise, they're gonna look for another job, to be honest. And then how are you making it good for them? What freedom do they have within that being back in the office? Are there you know, private offices they can sit in? Are they, how to mitigate their concerns?
Well, you know, some of your answers, actually not some of them, all of the answers and all the conversations we're having, it's all about change management, right? And so it's about communication, trust, and adequately sharing what you can share over a course of time, right? Because everything, you know, change is hard, and this has slapped us all on the back of the head, or, you know, or hit us all in the back of the head, and it's going to be an adjustment. You mentioned extroverts becoming introverts. I mean, I'm a hugger. You know, it's one of the things where I'm used to, you know, patting backs and shaking hands and giving people hugs, and it frankly has changed the way I approach my life socially, both in work and at home. So I think it's an adjustment, and in the same way that we adjust our language to be more inclusive, in the same way we adjust our technology to be more inclusive, it's all about articulating the changes and the rationale, just like you said, Jana.
Yeah. So I'm going to, we can keep the discussion, but I did want to acknowledge and thank people for attending. I know we're a few minutes past our time. We will stay on and answer questions. You can feel free to ask to unmute if you have some questions. But wanted to thank you each for participating and for joining us today. And depending on where you are on a Friday, or whether this is your weekend or not, wishing you a great rest of the day and weekend and some time off. And thank you for joining, and feel free to reach out to us and or stay on. We'll be here for a bit more. So thank you.